There was an article that was purported to have been written by her in one of the magazine, one of the Star or whatever those terrible things are, in which she made certain assertions and accusations that none of us ever believed.
There are television endings that linger in the memory like a half-forgotten dream, and then there are endings that leave wounds. Happy Days, the show that gave America the Fonz, the Cunningham family, and 11 seasons of carefully crafted nostalgia, deserved the former. What it got was something far more complicated. The story of how Happy Days truly went off the air is not simply a tale of a network pulling the plug on an aging sitcom. It is a story about one specific moment, one scene, that set off a chain reaction of decisions, miscalculations, and corporate blunders so severe that they permanently altered the way television said goodbye to its most beloved programs. Understanding that scene, and everything it triggered, requires going back to a time when Happy Days was not just a show, but a national institution. When Happy Days premiered in January of 1974, nobody at ABC expected it to become the defining sitcom of a generation. The show was built around a simple premise, a wholesome look at teenage life in 1950s Milwaukee, filtered through the warm lens of nostalgia. Ron Howard played Richie Cunningham, the earnest, good-natured son of Howard and Marion Cunningham, a family so reliably decent that they felt less like fictional characters and more like the neighbors every American wished they had. The show was comfortable, familiar, and reassuring in a way that only the best family television can be. For the first couple of seasons, it delivered exactly what it promised: gentle comedy, heartfelt lessons, and a portrait of an America that felt simpler and kinder than the turbulent 1970s outside the living room window. Then came the Fonz, and everything changed. Henry Winkler arrived on the set of Happy Days as a relative unknown, cast in what was originally a minor supporting role. Arthur Fonzarelli, the leather-jacketed, motorcycle-riding embodiment of 1950s cool, was never supposed to dominate the show. He was written as comic relief, a bit of edge to contrast with Richie's earnest wholesomeness. But audiences responded to Winkler's performance with a ferocity that caught everyone off guard. Within 2 seasons, Fonzie had transcended his supporting role entirely. He was on magazine covers. He was receiving more fan mail than the rest of the cast combined. Toy stores were selling Fonzie merchandise faster than they could restock it. Children across America were walking into school hallways with their thumbs up, trying to perfect the A. ABC executives, watching the ratings and the advertising revenue climb in direct proportion to Fonzie's screen time, drew what seemed to them like an obvious conclusion. The network began pushing to rename the show Fonzie's Happy Days, a rebranding that would have placed Winkler's character front and center in the very title of the program. On paper, the logic was sound. In practice, it nearly destroyed the show before it ever had the chance to destroy itself. Ron Howard, still in his early 20s and already demonstrating the creative instincts that would later make him one of Hollywood's most respected directors, delivered an ultimatum to ABC with a clarity and firmness that stunned the industry. If the title changed, he was walking. No negotiation, no counteroffer, no compromise. What made Howard stand remarkable was not just its boldness, but its accuracy. He understood something the network executives did not. Happy Days worked because it was an ensemble. Fonzie's cool was not a freestanding quality. It derived its power from contrast, from being measured against Richie's earnestness, Marion's warmth, Howard Cunningham's steady decency, and the easy friendship of the group surrounding them. Strip away that context, and Fonzie was just a guy in a leather jacket. Henry Winkler understood this too, and he backed Howard completely, telling the network directly that his own success depended on the world they had all built together. The title change was dropped. The show continued as it was, but the confrontation left something behind, a lingering awareness that ABC's relationship with Happy Days was not built on creative trust. It was built on ratings, and the moment those ratings became complicated, the network's judgment could not be relied upon. That awareness would prove prophetic. Because several years later, when the time came to bring Happy Days to a close, it was not a villain, or a scandal, or a creative collapse that ultimately took the show off the air the way it deserved. It was a scene. One specific scene performed by one actor in the final episode of the series that crystallized everything Happy Days had ever meant and simultaneously set in motion a series of decisions that would haunt the show's legacy for decades. By 1983, Happy Days was entering its final stretch. The show had survived cast departures, shifting audience tastes, and the natural fatigue that comes with any long-running series. Ron Howard had already left to pursue directing. Several other original cast members had moved on. The Fonz, once the show's magnetic center, was now a character adrift in storylines that struggled to find purpose. Ratings were declining, and ABC made the decision to end the series after its 11th season. A finale was planned for May of 1984, and creator Gary Marshall began thinking carefully about how to bring the Cunningham family story to a close. Marshall's instinct was not to go for spectacle. He wanted something quieter and more honest. He wanted the finale, titled Passages, to feel like a genuine farewell, not just to the characters, but to the audience that had spent 11 years with them. The episode wove together several emotional threads: Joni and Chachi's wedding, Fonzie's adoption of a young boy named Danny, and the general sense of a family moving into a new chapter. These were satisfying narrative conclusions, and on their own they would have made for a perfectly respectable series ending. But Marshall wanted something more. He wanted a moment that acknowledged the relationship between the show and its viewers in a direct and deliberate way. His idea was to have Tom Bosley, who played Howard Cunningham, break the fourth wall. In a quiet living room scene, Howard would turn to face the camera, look directly at the audience, and speak to them, not as a character performing in a sitcom, but as a father figure addressing the people who had welcomed his family into their homes for over a decade. ABC executives reacted with alarm. Breaking the fourth wall was considered a dangerous creative gamble in 1984. Television at that time operated on the unspoken agreement that the world on screen and the world in the living room were separate. Characters did not acknowledge the cameras. They did not speak to the audience. To do so was considered a violation of the contract that made fictional television work, a shattering of the illusion that could leave viewers feeling manipulated rather than moved. The network argued repeatedly that the moment would undercut everything Happy Days had built, that it would feel cheap, gimmicky, and self-congratulatory. They pushed back hard against Marshall's vision, insisting that the finale should stay within conventional boundaries. Marshall held firm. He had spent years building Happy Days into something that mattered to people, and he trusted his instincts about what those people deserved. After considerable tension, ABC reluctantly gave their approval, and on May 8, 1984, the moment arrived. Tom Bosley, sitting in the Cunningham living room, turned to the camera with the quiet authority that had defined Howard Cunningham for 11 seasons. He spoke about his children growing up, about the modest but profound satisfactions of family life, about the joy of watching the people you love find their own paths. And then he thanked the audience. He thanked them for being part of the family. He raised a toast to Happy Days. It was, by any measure, one of the most genuinely moving moments in the history of American sitcoms. Viewers, who had expected a standard episode ending, found themselves in tears. Critics who had prepared themselves to be dismissive found themselves without the words to explain why the scene worked as powerfully as it did. It worked because it was true. It was honest. It acknowledged something that television rarely has the courage to acknowledge, that the bond between a long-running show and its audience is real, and that it deserves to be honored at the end. That scene, Howard Cunningham's farewell speech, was the moment Happy Days truly went off the air. Not because it ended the broadcast, but because it completed something. It closed a loop that had been open for 11 years. It gave the audience the emotional resolution they had earned, and it did so with a grace and sincerity that left nothing unfinished. If the story of Happy Days had ended there, it would have been remembered as one of the finest series finales ever produced. It did not end there. Earlier in 1984, ABC had faced a scheduling problem. The network held the broadcast rights to the Winter Olympics in Sarajevo, and the games, running through February, had forced several shows out of their regular primetime slots. Among those displaced was Happy Days, which had a handful of episodes ready to air in February that never made it to broadcast. When the Olympics ended and the network's regular schedule resumed, those episodes remained in the vault, unaired and unresolved. What happened next represents one of the most baffling decisions in network television history. Rather than shelving those leftover episodes permanently, recognizing that the show now had a finale in place and that airing additional material would undermine it completely, ABC chose to air them anyway. Beginning in June of 1984, just weeks after Tom Bosley had delivered his farewell speech to the nation, Happy Days returned to the airwaves. 5 episodes, filmed before the finale but never broadcast, were released across the summer and into September. The damage was immediate and profound. Viewers, who had said their goodbyes, who had cried at Howard Cunningham's speech and felt the clean resolution of a story properly completed, suddenly found the Cunningham family back on their screens as though nothing had happened. There was no explanation, no framing, no acknowledgement that the finale had already aired. The episodes simply appeared, cheerful and disconnected, like guests who had not noticed the party was over. Each episode that aired deepened the wound. So how was your weekend? Low notes, school dazed, good news, bad news, and finally on September 24, 1984, an episode called Fonzie's Spots, in which television's most iconic embodiment of cool was subjected to hazing rituals at Howard Cunningham's Leopard Lodge. There was no warmth in it, no resolution, no sense of occasion. The Fonz, whose entire character had been built on a specific kind of dignity, was reduced to a punchline, and that became the final image of Happy Days that millions of viewers carried with them, not Howard's grateful speech, not Joni and Chachi's wedding, not Fonzie adopting a child and finding the family he had always needed, but a sitcom character being mocked by his friends in a scene that was never meant to close anything. The ripple effects of ABC's decision extended far beyond the feelings of confused and disappointed fans. The entertainment industry paid close attention. Producers, writers, and directors who had watched the Happy Days finale with admiration watched the subsequent broadcast of those leftover episodes with horror. The lesson was stark and impossible to ignore. A network, left to its own devices, would treat the ending of a beloved series as a scheduling problem to be managed rather than a cultural moment to be honored. Creative people who had worked for years to build something meaningful could see that work undone in a single summer by executives who did not understand or did not care about the difference between broadcasting content and completing a story. The response from the industry was gradual but significant. Contracts negotiated in the years following Happy Days began to include provisions that specifically addressed finale protection. Writers and showrunners pushed for and increasingly received guarantees that the ending of a series would be treated as a closed event, that unaired episodes would not be dumped onto the public after a finale had already established the conclusion of the narrative. The Happy Days disaster became a reference point in negotiations, a specific example of what could go wrong when creative considerations were subordinated entirely to scheduling convenience. For the cast, the aftermath was complicated in ways that went beyond professional frustration. Henry Winkler, who had poured a decade of his life into Arthur Fonzarelli, found that the chaotic ending of the series compounded an identity crisis he was already experiencing. Fonzie had made him famous in a way that proved difficult to escape. Casting directors and audiences struggled to see past the leather jacket, and for years after Happy Days ended, Winkler found the doors he expected to open remaining stubbornly closed. He would eventually find his way through, building a second and third act in Hollywood that included genuine critical recognition, but the years immediately following the show's conclusion were marked by a disorientation that the anticlimactic final episodes only deepened. Tom Bosley, who had delivered the farewell speech that should have been the final word on Happy Days, carried the weight of that moment for the rest of his life in the most dignified possible way. Audiences who met him at events, who stopped him in public, consistently returned to that scene as the thing they most wanted to talk about. His passing in 2010 was mourned with an intensity that reflected how completely he had become identified with Howard Cunningham, and how deeply that character's farewell had resonated with people who felt they had genuinely lost a member of their own family. Erin Moran, who played Joni Cunningham, faced a far more painful trajectory. The financial and professional struggles that followed Happy Days were severe, and the spin-off that was supposed to give her character a new life collapsed under the weight of network indifference and poor ratings. Her death in 2017 brought renewed attention to the difficulties faced by performers whose identities had been absorbed so completely by their roles that the end of a series felt like the end of something essential about themselves. The story did not end entirely in grief. In 2024, on the 50th anniversary of Happy Days, Ron Howard and Henry Winkler appeared together at the Emmy Awards. They stood before a jukebox in a moment of deliberate and affectionate recreation, and when Winkler struck the machine and the familiar theme song played, the audience in the auditorium and the millions watching at home responded with something that felt very much like relief. Critics described it as the real finale, the goodbye that the show had deserved and never quite received. For the surviving members of the cast and creative team, it offered a form of closure that 4 decades of interviews and reunions had never fully provided. That moment mattered precisely because the original ending had been so thoroughly compromised. The fact that audiences still needed a resolution in 2024 is itself a measure of how completely ABC's post-finale broadcasts had failed to provide one. Tom Bosley's speech had offered genuine closure in 1984, and then 5 unnecessary episodes had taken that closure away. The 2024 tribute restored something, not the lost episodes or the wasted years, but the sense that what Happy Days had built was real and worth honoring. The scene that took Happy Days off the air for good was not Fonzie's Spots, broadcast in September of 1984, with no fanfare and no meaning. It was Tom Bosley, sitting in a living room set in Burbank, California, looking into a camera and thanking the American public for 11 years of loyalty. That was the scene that completed Happy Days. Everything that came after it was not an ending but an erasure, a network's failure to understand that the story it had been entrusted with did not belong to ABC. It belonged to the people who had watched it, grown up with it, and needed it to end on terms that honored what it had meant to them. The lesson of Happy Days is not simply that networks make mistakes, though they plainly do. It is that the relationship between a long-running television series and its audience carries a weight that resists purely commercial logic. When a show has been part of people's lives for 11 years, its ending is not a programming decision. It is a responsibility. Gary Marshall understood that. Tom Bosley delivered it, and ABC in the summer of 1984 threw it away. The industry spent the next several decades making sure no network could do the same thing again. That, as much as anything else, is the real legacy of Happy Days. Not just the laughter and the nostalgia and the leather jacket, but the hard lesson that some stories, once properly finished, must be allowed